Welcome. I'll give you guys a few more minutes just to find a seat. Well, good evening, friends, and welcome to Regent College. My name is Alex Stroshine, and I'm the bookstore manager. We're so excited to be here together for the book launch of Dr. Quentin Genuis' new book, Recovering People, Addiction, Personhood, and the Life of the Church, published by Cascade last year. It's such an important book and topic, especially for those of us living in Vancouver. As we begin tonight's proceedings, we want to acknowledge that Regent sits on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. We kindly ask that if you have any phones or devices that might ring, ding, or otherwise beep, that you please put them in silent mode. Quentin will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. We have mics set up at the back of the chapel on either side, so if you have a question, you can line up there and wait to be called upon. Following the Q&A, we invite you to join Quentin in the bookstore for a book signing. Now I'll hand it off to Dr. Ross Hastings to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Alex, and my pleasure to welcome you tonight to this event at Regent. And however, before I get down to the business of introducing Quentin, I want to say that sad news just came across our news feed that 8 students have been shot in Tumbler Ridge, at a Tumbler Ridge school. And this is extremely sad, and numbers of other people have been injured. So I thought before we get going in our program, we might just pray for that community and for those loved ones who've lost their children. God of all comfort, Father of mercies, we commit the community of Tumbler Ridge to you tonight. We ask, Lord, especially for comfort for those who have lost their loved ones. Pray for those who've been injured, that they might have a good recovery. Bless the medical staff there and in other places where these people have been sent. We just ask, oh God, for a sense of your comforting presence and your peace in this community at this time. I pray in Christ's name. Amen. So it's my special privilege to introduce Dr. Quentin Genuis. He's an emergency physician at St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver here. He serves as the physician ethicist for Providence Healthcare, where he is involved in ethics consultations, education, and research. He holds a master's degree from the best school in the UK, the University of St. Andrews. He is a sessional faculty here at Regent and also the professional in residence with us at this time. Here at Regent, he teaches on topics including medical ethics, addiction, and vocation. He has published peer-reviewed articles in both science and bioethics fields, and this is his first book, which I hope will not be his last, as he works out his theology of personhood and what it means to be human in an era of rampant and radical individualism. Quentin loves teaching in a variety of places, academic, church, and clinical settings on topics including human freedom and agency, death and dying, theology of the body, virtue ethics, compassion, dignity, and care of persons with addictions. In his spare time, he loves growing dahlias and pole beans, which I must confess I have no idea what those are. Reading fiction and visiting the farmer's market with his family. 2 of his kids are here tonight, Leela and Rowan, and we're glad to have them with us, as well as the donuts. It's not very often that a speaker brings donuts, so if you haven't got one already, hopefully you'll get them later. So on that note, let us join me in welcoming Quentin Genuis.
Hello, good evening. I'm sorry to report at the beginning of our time together that I put out the donuts beforehand, but then I was reprimanded for doing so by Chandel, who is the boss of this evening, along with Alex and Ross and others. So you'll have to wait for about an hour. You'll have to listen to me talk for a while, but the donuts are coming. I want to begin, I have a lot of thank yous to say tonight. I want to begin with just a few preliminary thank yous. Thank you to Ross for hosting this evening. I have a lot of thank yous to say to Ross. In addition to hosting this evening, Ross was the first person who invited me to speak at Regent. It's been one of the big honors of my life to be part of this community over the past couple of years, and Ross was the first person who invited me to do that. Ross was also the person who told me I should think about writing a book. One time, just across the hallway there in room 100, sometime after a Soul of Ministry lecture, Ross humbly and cheerfully said, "You should think about writing a book about this. It could be a gift to the church in Vancouver." So a small encouragement from someone I really looked up to. So thank you for this and for that, Ross. I want to thank Alex and Chandel and so many other people from Regent for hosting this event and for coordinating, doing many, many things that I am so very bad at in terms of planning and those pieces of the puzzle. And I want to thank all of you for coming, especially those of you who know me. One of the humbling things about writing a book like this, a project like this, that attempts to have a very high vision for how we ought to treat other persons, means suggesting a vision that I myself fail to live up to so frequently. And the truth is that those of you who know me, who work with me, who see me on a day-to-day basis, know that better than anyone else. The ways that I fail to live up to the vision that I try to suggest in this book. And so despite that, my many failings, I'm grateful for your grace and your support being here tonight. With those preliminary thank yous out of the way, I want to begin, as is my tendency, by telling you a story, and specifically an emergency department story. This is actually not a St. Paul's story. For those of you St. Paul's people here who are keeping score, this is a MSJ story. Mount St. Joseph's Hospital is the other emergency department I work in. That's a sister hospital to St. Paul's, and I work there just a few times per month. And the other day, I think it was mid last week, I was working a morning shift at MSJ when I met a patient, and for the sake of this setting, we'll call him Frank. And Frank presented to the emergency department because he thought he had an infected leg. And you could see from across the room that Frank did indeed have an infected leg because he was wearing over-large Bermuda shorts in Vancouver in January, and one of his legs was very scrawny and thin and was covered in scars and old track marks. And his other leg was red and hot and swollen, and to my eye, obviously infected. And I assessed Frank, and I told him that I thought his leg was indeed infected, and he did indeed need some IV antibiotics, and we planned to give him that and for him to leave and then come back to the emergency department the next day for a repeat assessment. Fairly open and shut, bread and butter, MSJ, Tuesday morning case. Frank told me, however, at the end of that first sort of assessment that he needed a note, and he told me that he was staying at an addiction recovery place in Vancouver, and they needed him to have a note to bring back telling them sort of the medical plan. So I went and fought with the computer, which unfortunately in our era takes longer than actually assessing the patient, to try to get an appropriate note to take back to Frank. And by the time I had done that, our ever efficient and excellent nurses had already moved him out of his initial assessment zone into a hallway chair where he was to receive his antibiotics. And if you're familiar with emergency departments in Canada in this day and age, you would not be surprised to hear that hallway chair was never intended as a care space. It was intended as a place for the lab techs to gather their equipment. So Frank was sitting in this tiny chair. I sat down, hugging my knees up to my chest across from him on the floor, and in between us was this tiny little narrow space, and the lab techs kept going back and through in between us, pushing their carts. Frank and I were not alone in that hallway, however. There was me again, tucked up, sitting on the ground, leaning against the wall. And there was Frank across from me, nervous, restless, talking much too loudly, sharing much too personal details about himself and his journey with everyone who would listen to him. And there was a older woman sitting beside him who most decidedly did not want to listen to him. If I could describe this neighbor of Frank's in one word, that word would be prim. She was sitting, her shoulders and hips pointed as aggressively away from Frank as she could manage, everything in her body language asking, how did I end up here in this hallway, this dim hallway, sitting beside this drug addict? And as you can tell, I'm no real judge of such things, but she was dressed in what I judged to be quite fancy, well put together clothing. The only thing incongruous about her prim appearance was that her hand held up was wrapped in a white linen towel that was soaked with blood. And her triage note read, fingertip amputation. We won't get into the details of that, it's not relevant to this evening. But there she was, stuck next to Frank, most decidedly trying not to engage with him in any way. And as I sat opposite Frank, I gave him his note, and I just asked him a little bit about himself. And Frank was all too keen to share. And he told me a story that, tragically, is an extremely common story in our time, in our cities. It's extremely common in the downtown east side, but it is also common in your workplace, in your church, on your street. And that is a story of a life that is marked, profound suffering that is caused by a significant addiction. And for Frank, the main object of his addiction for several decades was crack cocaine, but he told me he had dabbled in all kinds of other substance. You name it, he said, he had tried it. And he said for years and years he had tried to get clean, but he told me, again, all too loudly, that he didn't feel comfortable asking for help, and he said, I never wanted to put in the work. But just a few weeks, a month or so before I saw Frank, he said to me, I hit my rock bottom finally after all this time, and I realized that it was time to ask for help. And Frank, thankfully, had met some people who showed him grace and kindness and wrapped their arms around him. And he had ended up in this treatment facility. And he told me in the weeks that he had been there, he had begun for the first time in many years to experience joy and purpose and friendship. Things that he never thought he would have. And sitting there across from Frank, we felt the miracle take place. Frank leaned forward and, a bit quieter this time, said to me, and doctor, I've started praying again. And he told me he hadn't prayed for 20 years. And somehow, both empowering and brought about from this journey of recovery, he had found what it took to ask for help. He said he wasn't totally sure which God he was praying to, but that he was working on the discipline of prayer. And he told me that on that day, Frank's from a small town originally, he told me he had been afraid to come to a hospital in a big city, afraid of being shuffled to the side or blown off or looked down upon. And that before coming in, he had stood in the parking lot and prayed that he had met someone that he could talk to. And like I said, we and I felt something in that moment that I hope you have felt in your own life. These strange, often unexpected moments that are holy, that are moments of grace and beauty. And I stumbled through all of my thank yous and bless yous and encouragement as best I could to Frank. And then the moment was over, and I knew that I had to move on to my next thing. But before I stood up, I happened to turn and look at Frank's prim neighbor. And I was surprised to see her no longer looking away, but turn towards Frank, looking at him with an expression of such affection that it shocked me. And I realized in that moment that the miracle was big enough to pull her into. What had happened in Frank's life was big enough for me, and indeed big enough for her. And this, my friends, is why I wrote a book about addiction. I moved to Vancouver 6-odd years ago from Victoria, just to spend a year here and to get a year of enhanced skills training in emergency medicine. And our plan was not to stay in Vancouver. I didn't know anything about the downtown east side. or St. Paul's or have any interest in the subject of addiction. And yet, doing a year of training and then beginning working at St. Paul's, I began to have the unspeakable blessing of having encounters like this. And when I took the time to try to see and listen, I had the incredible blessing of seeing features of other people's lives that are so easy to miss. People with addiction in our time, especially people in neighborhoods like the downtown east side, are so often seen primarily as problems to solve. And even for many people who care deeply about the issues of addiction, they accept models of what addiction is or why it's caused that place such distance between them and the other, inhibiting them from looking across at people like Frank in such a way that develops kinship and friendship and mutual relationships, but inhibiting them also from looking up at people like Frank when their lives display the good and true and beautiful in ways that all of us can and should learn from. And I felt in my bones this sense of moral rebellion against the ways that so many features of lives of people like Frank are often overlooked and missed. And often I didn't know what to do with that moral rebellion, but over time I felt this growing sense that was greatly aided, as I will say, by my much wiser wife, Kaylin, to try to use that to say something about it. And all of that is to say is that I felt called to write a book about addiction as a result of my vocation. And I wanted to read you just a little quote about calling from a Frederick Buechner book. I hope many of you are familiar with his work. But when he went into ministry, when he made a life decision to enter the ministry, a woman who he knew quipped. She said, "I hear you are entering the ministry. Was it your own idea or were you poorly advised?" And this is what he wrote later in his journal reflecting on this interaction. He said this: "The answer that she could not have heard, even if I had given it, was that it was not an idea at all, neither my own nor anyone else's. It was a lump in the throat. It was an itching in the feet. It was a stirring in the blood at the sound of rain. It was a sickening of the heart at the sight of misery. It was a clamoring of ghosts. It was a name which, when I wrote it out in a dream, I knew was a name worth dying for, even if I was not brave enough to do the dying myself and could not even name the name for sure. Come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you a high and driving peace." This is for me one of the clearest things I've ever read for articulating what it means to have a calling. And so before I ever knew what I wanted to say about addiction, I had this deep conviction of trying to write as an act of loyalty and affection for my friends and my patients who have addiction. When I was writing this book, I went on a few writing retreats just for a night or two. I have some generous friends who let me stay in their house on Bowen Island, and I would write on a sticky note and put in front of me, "Be faithful to the project," which was my shorthand for write as an act of loyalty and affection. And I want to pause at this moment and acknowledge that I know for many of you, thinking about the issue of addiction, being in a room like this, is not a merely intellectual venture. I know, because I've made many mistakes in this area, that for many of you, for many of us, this is a personal question. It relates to your vocations, your own life or history, the stories of people you love very much. If that's you, I just want to say thank you for being here. But I want to say personally that my goal in everything that I wrote in this book was to speak to and about and for you in a way that is good and true and beautiful. To get to a book or an academic argument from that kind of gut instinct, these deep angsty feelings, was something that took a lot of time. And the first question that I ran into when trying to think and write about addiction was that I wasn't totally sure what addiction was. And I worked in an environment that is supposedly the center of excellence in all things addiction in Canada. And yet I found that I was surrounded by others who also did not really know what addiction was. And I found myself in all of these 3 a.m. physician lounge conversations with my colleagues, turning over these difficult interactions that we had. Encountering colleagues who were thoughtful and wanted to help patients, but struggled to know how to define what we were saying, what we were talking about, what we were seeing in the lives of persons like Frank. And without rehashing any of the argument of the book in too much detail, often the struggles that those people had is they were torn between the two common ways that our society narrates what addiction is. One of those being called the choice model, which narrates addiction primarily as just a bunch of bad choices that are rooted in some kind of hedonism or degeneracy or something. And the other extreme pole is usually called the disease or the medical model of addiction, that says that people with addiction are just passive victims of a brain disease that renders them non-agents with respect to that behavior. And I came to be able to articulate what I felt many of my colleagues felt in their bones, in their guts, that each of these was missing a piece of the explanatory puzzle. But moreover, each of these was missing the person. The most important things about what it means to care for those with addiction, their story, their history, their mind, their capacity as an agent. And so the first hurdle that I had to clear to figure out how to speak about this issue became the first section of the book, where I try to outline what's wrong with these two more simple models of addiction, and then offer an alternative model for what addiction is, which I've called in the book a personal model. And the core instinct behind that model is the conviction that addiction is a problem that happens to persons. Not just brains, not just wills, but whole persons, body, mind, and spirit. Building off of this, the latter half of the book, the second and third sections, try to build from that clarifying model to answer the question, what should we do about it? I sat in the physician room with other physicians who struggled to put their finger on what addiction was, and I also spent a lot of time in church and parachurch circles with Christian people who were passionate about communities like the Downtown East Side, and yet struggled to connect core truths of the gospel to caring for persons with addiction. And again, some of this was because of the models. If you think that addiction is primarily or only a medical problem, it can seem like a category mistake to apply the life of the church to that problem. And yet I believed and continue to believe more than ever that churches are the kinds of place that should see themselves as belonging at the center of journeys of recovery. But to see ourselves that way is to be called to a set of new and difficult practices: costly hospitality, radical interdependence, confession of sin, lament, hope. And so the latter section of the book picks up these features, these virtues and practices that I believe should characterize church communities that hope to see themselves as places of recovery from addiction. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but I want to pause in the middle of these more substantive remarks to offer some thank yous, if that's okay. There's many thank yous in the acknowledgments of the book, but there's several people who are here today who it would be amiss not to acknowledge them in this context. And as you might probably guess, the top of that list is my wife, Kaylin, who is here. There's a million things that I could say to you, love, as thanks for all that you've done. To keep it short, though, Kaylin is my primary model of loyal friendship. Kaylin is my primary model of costly and creative hospitality. Kaylin is my primary model of what it means to charitably listen to other people, not to read their lives in terms of what they can do for me or what they mean to me, but to simply listen to the other, as a person with inherent significance who bears the image of God. Without Kaylin's patient example in these and many other regards, I certainly wouldn't be here, and this book would not be here. So thanks, love. Alongside Kaylin, I just want to acknowledge my two of my four children, Leela and Rowan, are in the room. Yes, I told them I would mention their names. So, second person I want to thank is my dear friend, one of my dearest and oldest friends, who is here, my friend Michael Chin. Michael, as I said, is one of my oldest friends. Michael also is a medical student and had to do a flex research project as part of his med school. And so Michael was my research associate as I did the research for the book. And I have so many fond memories. For a couple of years, me and Michael read Addiction's memoirs together, and then we sat in my house and talked about them. And to tell you a little bit about what Michael is like, both in terms of rigor and enthusiasm, I've brought a few of the books that he read for me. So this is an example of a book, and Michael added a sticky note to something that he thought was interesting or notable. As you can see, there are a sticky note on most every page. Some of them have more than one sticky note, which speaks, as I said, not only to the rigor and the excellence he put into this project, but also to the enthusiasm with which he approached it. Michael is also, a final thing to say, one of my children's favorite uncles. And so when I told my kids that Uncle Michael would be here today, they insisted that I bring him a present. So we went into a store to buy flowers, and we came out with this cactus. So this is a thank you to you for everything that you have done. My third thank you is to my mother, who is here tonight, who flew from Edmonton to surprise me, which is such a gift to me. My mom is the person who taught me how to write. She taught me how to write both in the young child sense of how to shape an A with a pencil. She also taught me how to write a paragraph. I remember sitting at our solid wood table when I was in junior high and having an assignment to write a paragraph and going through it with you and you saying to me, this isn't a paragraph, it's just a collection of sentences, but they're not related together with the snake where every sentence relates to the thesis. And over many hours, and admittedly I was probably not enthusiastic about all of those things, my mom taught me how to write, how to make an argument to be consistent. And some of my favorite moments of writing this book, the last thing before I sent it to the publisher, was I sat at our kitchen island and I went through this book with my mom, who said to me more than once, this isn't a paragraph, it's just a collection of sentences, and sent me back to rewrite them. And so when I was your age, Rowan, and now, my mom is still teaching me how to write. Many other members of my family that I want to thank. In particular, my brother Emerson is here. Emerson has always been and will always be my oldest sibling, my big brother. And Emerson, along the way in writing this book, gave me many wise nudges in one direction that really helped me stay faithful to the project and on the straight and narrow. So thank you. I also want to thank Doug Herring, who is here. Many of you know Doug as an amazing theologian. He's visiting us from Edmonton this evening. Doug was my first teacher of academic theology. And I had the misfortune, I would have said then it was a misfortune. When I was 17 and I graduated high school, I just wanted to study chemistry and go to medical school. I would have said I had no interest in the humanities, theology, history, all that nonsense. But I went to a liberal arts university that forced me to take these breadth courses to expand my mind, and I was very frustrated about it. So I landed at 7:30 in the morning on Tuesdays and Thursdays in an introductory theology class with Dr. Douglas Herring, and those classes changed my life. Doug was one of the people in those seasons of life who saw something in me that I certainly did not see in myself. And then later, just over 10 years ago, I was an angsty med student. I didn't know what my vocation would be. I didn't really like med school very much, and I missed theology. If any of you here are angsty master students at Regent and you look at me and say, oh, that's someone who's got it figured out, I promise I never did, and I still don't now. And in one of those moments where I didn't know where I was going, I was working at the Old Strathcona Farmers Market in Edmonton on a Saturday selling pears, and my old theology professor, Doug Herring, walked by, and I think he bought some pears, and I rudely unloaded my vocational angst upon him while he was just trying to have a friendly farmers market Saturday. And he, in his cheerful way, said, you should just take a year off med school and do a master's degree in theology in Scotland. A specific recommendation. But I did. And without that little conversation, I, again, wouldn't be here today. And so I am so conscious here that both so many of the good things in my life, including this book, are so dependent on small acts of grace and kindness from many. So thank you, Doug. Finally, by way of thanks, I just want to acknowledge so many of the people who are here who work in or represent agencies that work in the Downtown East Side. When I first moved to Vancouver, and I again didn't know anything about addiction or St. Paul's or the Downtown East Side, I drove down Hastings with a family member of mine. And we saw some of the scenes which, if you've driven down Hastings, you know can be quite surprising and shocking if you haven't seen them before. And this family member of mine looked at me and despairingly said, where are all the Christians? How could this be happening? Where are all the Christians? Believing that if things are like this, there must be no Christians here. Amongst the many, many, many things I've learned in the intervening time is that so many Christians are there, living there, working there, praying there, serving, learning, suffering there, together with our other neighbors who live there. That isn't to say that we don't need more. It still, to me, feels in this addiction conversation that the harvest is plentiful and the workers are few. And yet in everything that I've come to think and believe, I have benefited to learn from those of you who are there. There are some of you who are here who are from or who represent Jacob's Well. Jacob's Well is a friendship center in the Downtown East Side. It's one of my and my kids' favorite places in the world. As an aside, the royalties from this book are going to Jacob's Well, so if you balk at the cost of a book in this day and age, at least you can feel a bit better that you're supporting a great organization like Jacob's Well. There's some of you friends here from UGM, Heath, my friend, and other people from Urban Chapel, people from Christ City, especially Christ City, East Vancouver, and so many other people. It's a privilege for me to be a junior worker with you who've been there longer than me, and I hope to learn more in the future together with and from you. Okay, that's the end of my thank yous. Thank you for your grace in listening to them. I see them as simply necessary. I want to conclude with a simple word about hope. One of the core projects of this book was to speak in a distinctly Christian way, to speak as a Christian to other Christians. There are a lot of books out there about addiction, but what I felt, again, in my guts was there was not enough that spoke about this issue in a simply and clearly way that asked what is distinct about a Christian view of addiction and about a Christian approach to persons with addiction. What I've come to believe amongst many other Christian distinctives is that in our time, one of the things that should mark Christians as different is hope. From my work in the field of addictions, I can tell you that the underlying emotion underneath so many societal conversations is despair. Speaking to other physicians and people who work in the Downtown East Side and having some degree of engagement in my vocation with political policy people, underneath solutions that can seem like they radically swing between different kinds of interventions is a deep sense of not knowing what to do. Underneath some of the interventions and policies that seem so minimal at helping our neighbors with addiction is a belief that we can't do any better. Maybe the best we can ever hope for some of our neighbors is a slight bit of risk reduction today. That might be the best it ever gets. But my friends, Christians should be people who have the courage to look at the bad things in the face, to go incarnationally to where the difficult suffering is, not to glaze over it or to simply drive by. But at the same time, Christians should be the people who are freed to do so because we have hope that all will be well, and all will be well, and all manner of thing will be well, even on the downtown east side, even in the addiction in your own life that you feel you can't be free from. All will be made well by the God who hates injustice and who longs to heal us. And so Christians, firstly, should have hope for recovery from addiction. Even in cases of very severe addiction, we should be people who are distinct by practicing hope that recovery can and does happen. We should have that hope sustained by being part of churches and other Christian communities that justify that hope, by being places where many forms of dramatic sanctification are possible and common, made possible by the way that we develop our own agency through discipline, by the way we empower the agency of others through friendship and listening and hospitality, and ultimately made possible by the grace of God who works through us, through the Holy Spirit, to make our lives good and beautiful. And so part of hope is having hope for recovery from addiction. But also, even for lives that do not enter final recovery from addiction, we as Christians should be marked by hope. One of the challenges of the way that addiction recovery is often narrated in secular spaces is that there's a strong binary between people who remain addicts and people who enter recovery, as if there are addicted lives that are successful because the person enters recovery, and lives that are, in the final analysis, failures if the person never enters recovery. But one of my favorite stories, if I can tell you one more story, is about addiction, is a story that might be true, or some monk might have made up sometime. And this story takes place on a monastery on Mount Athos in Greece. And the story is sometimes called the alcoholic monk. And there once was a monastery with a whole bunch of monks who lived there. And one of the monks snuck off from the monastery and got drunk every single day. And all the other monks were embarrassed by him. And they were afraid that he was scandalizing the pilgrims and the people who came to worship at the monastery. And one day, the alcoholic monk died. And the other monks were very pleased about this. And so they went to the elder of the monastery to tell him cheerfully that the scandal monk had finally died and would no longer inhibit their witness. And the elder told them calmly when they came and told him this, that he already knew that the alcoholic monk had died because he had seen a battalion of angels coming from heaven to collect his soul and bring it to God. And the elder then went on to tell them the story of the life of this man. And without taking too much time, this man had suffered profoundly and had developed an addiction primarily as a result of being a victim of many hardships and sufferings early on in his life. And when he found that he could not be free of his addiction, he came to the monastery and asked the elder for help. And the elder told him to join in the life of the community and to pray to God day by day to help him reduce the amount that he drank. And the elder said that over the course of years, this man had cut down his drinks from 20 to 19 to 18, such that by the end of his life, he was only having 2 drinks a day, still getting drunk. And the elder described his journey of discipline and sanctification from 20 to 2 as being a dramatic and beautiful form of sanctification, a powerful witness, when viewed in the right way, to the power of God to save. And so the journey of the alcoholic monk did not end in simple success or failure. It ended in the God who loves and sees and knows us. the God to whom none of the hidden things in our life are hidden, the God before whom the small acts of kindness or grace or courage of your life are celebrated and held in tenderness and infinite joy. And so Christians should be free to have high hope for the lives of persons with addiction. We should always set freedom as our goal and our aim, and never aim lower. And yet, for those of you like me who work in places like St. Paul's, where we see tragic death from persons who are never free from their addiction, we also can have great hope that all will be well. Because the journey of all of our lives does not end simply in success or failure. The journeys of our life end with God. To that end, I want to conclude with a brief reading from the Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started from and know the place for the first time, through the unknown, remembered gate, when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning. At the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall, and the children in the apple tree. Not known because not looked for, but heard, half heard, in the stillness between two waves of the sea. Quick now, here, now, always, a condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flame are infolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. Amen.
Having read this book, I want to tell you it's a very good book. For me, there are a couple of measures of a good book. I don't have any stickies, but just about every line in this book is underlined. This book is also, I would argue, a beautiful book about a very challenging topic. It made me think. So there's theology everywhere in this. You don't write about this without a knowledge of theology, so it's theologically nuanced. Regarding theological anthropology, hamartiology, soteriology, pneumatology, ecclesiology, and eschatology. They're all there. And that's very wonderful. But above all, this book made me cry. And there are a couple of places in it where I just had to stop and cry. It's incredible. So let me urge you, when the time comes to... I really have a burden upon my heart that every pastor and every layperson in this city should have a copy of this. So let me urge you to participate in that in just a few moments. But we're going to have a question and answer time. But before we have that, I'm just going to ask you to stand and stretch. Give your neighbor a holy kiss. No, you don't need to do that. Hey. Okay, folks, you may take a seat. Quentin is going to take questions at this point. Can I just encourage you to ask questions that are really questions? Your life story is, I'm sure, very wonderful, but not for tonight. And so let me urge you to ask questions to Quentin, and after a while we'll make the announcement for us to go and take part of the donuts and also the purchasing of books.
Yeah, yes.
Hi there. Thanks so much for your talk. What you were talking about in terms of the medical model of addiction reminds me of this kind of sense of determinism that can come with like a physiological understanding of illness and disease. And then your person-based model, I think, upends part of that with addiction. Has that challenged the way that you understand other than addiction in terms of healthcare and health?
Yes, it has. Thank you so much for that question. I often feel like with my wife, Kaylin, one of the things that we came to, or I came to over time, helped by Kent Dunnington, who's an amazing philosopher and has written about addiction, is the way that this choice model, disease model debate is one face of this like voluntarism, determinism debate that has played itself out in many different issues over time. And there are new and old voluntarisms, there are new and old determinisms. And ever since I felt settled in seeing addiction this way, I feel like me and Kaylin all the time are talking about some debate. I think some mental health things are maybe one point where we say, this is another like choice model, disease model thing. Or another voluntarism, determinism thing. So yes, I think in so many areas where we talk about human behavior, it can be easy to slide into the simple explanatory models. That behavior is produced either just because that person wants to behave that way, and if it's unhealthy behavior, that's produced just because they're willing badly, they want what's evil. Or it's easy to slide into the, and often out of a desire to be compassionate, it's easy to slide into the determinist model and say, that's not really a behavior at all. It doesn't involve their mind or their agency. They're just subject to something else. And most of our contemporary determinisms are the sort of neurobiological determinisms. Thank you, Leela. My kids were reciting T.S. Eliot with me as well. We've been memorizing it for a few weeks just as my sneaky plan so they would know what we were saying tonight. But the short answer is yes, in so many areas of life. It's easy when we talk about human behavior and the puzzle of why we behave the way we do, why we behave in ways that are contrary to the good, and especially why we behave in ways that are contrary to what we know to be the good. There are the tempting explanations that are just those simple poles, and the truth is almost always somewhere in between.
Thank you. I do have another, but I don't want to be rude.
Well, sure. No, it looks like you're still first in line. So.
Is that okay? Am I breaking protocol? Are we good? So just in terms of the person-centered model, and maybe this is like a linguistic choice versus like an actual semantic similarity, as someone outside of healthcare myself, despite my best efforts, there's this idea of patient-centered care. And it then involves, I guess, the decision-making framework and relationships and processes that I'm not privy to because I don't work in healthcare. How do you see your understanding that you've developed in your book as a person-based lens for understanding addiction that comes from a Christian perspective? How do you see that as different or the same as like the secular patient-based care that would be given to someone with an addiction disorder?
That's a wonderful question as well. For me, I think the significance of personhood language pushes things a little bit further. So when we say patient-centered care, I agree that the way that we approach medicine shouldn't be, we're always tempted this again in contemporary medicine where the medicine is much more about technological control of the body rather than listening to a patient. And so I think patient-centered care and medical education is appropriate in orienting to us towards everything we do should be about producing health in this patient. For me, to call the patient a person is to suggest an additional set of things about them. So what are we talking about when we're talking about a patient? Be that an unborn child or an elderly person with dementia or a person with disabilities or you or I. For me, it's important to say that's not just a body, that's not just an autonomous brain that ought to be respected and have rights. When we call that patient a person, We are using a term that says, in many ways, they are like me. They are intrinsically significant. They participate with me in shared rationality and in shared nature. But also to call them a person is to recognize them as other. You might say that personhood evokes that older term neighbor, which is something Oliver Donovan would say when he talked about personhood. The neighbor is someone who is like me, but is also utterly other than me. And so for me, in short, the language of personhood suggests additional moral content compared to simply patient.
I would love to hear your thoughts on, with there being so many different types of addiction, from an addiction to a substance, to addiction to people's approval. What was it like to kind of study that broad range, and to what degree are the problems, the roots, and the solutions overlap, and to what degree are they different?
Thank you. Really great question. And one of the reasons that I began to have this intellectual bug in my brain that we didn't know what we were talking about is that even in casual conversation, you hear addiction appealed to in so many different ways. So you have the really narrow disease model people that say addiction is only the thing that can be seen on MRI of the brain, and some of those people say addiction is only to drugs, and we shouldn't use addiction in other categories. Most common sense definitions see sort of phenomenologically certain behavioral categories, gambling, pornography being the two most obvious ones, as significantly overlapping. But increasingly in our time, you also see the proliferation of addictive diagnoses. If you read writers like Anna Lemke or Gabor Mate, best-selling writers in the field of addiction, they describe themselves as being addicted to Beethoven or romance novels. And some other people even describe themselves as being addicted to the love of their spouse or to walks in the park or those kinds of things. And so one of the things that is present in the popular conversation and even in the academic conversation is this push and pull between definitions that intuitively I felt were over narrow and other definitions that I intuitively felt were over broad. One of the challenges of this book was trying to speak then about addictions that in many ways can be very different, but also suggest that they fall under the same umbrella. Without saying too much about kind of the content, where I land is that it is very possible to be addicted to a wide variety of things, which is to say that our habits, even our good habits, even our habitual attachments to good things can become disordered and destructive quite quickly if we're not very careful. And so I want to be with the broad people insofar as I say, addiction is not just this narrow problem of those people out there, and addiction is a problem that's in here and all of us are prone to developing unhelpful attachments, even to good things if we're not careful, to order all of the loves of our life under the love of God. With that being said, one thing I've tried to do in the book is to distinguish the category of addiction from the broader category of habit. And I think that some thinkers just see addiction as any case where there's any kind of compulsive or compelled or habitual behavior. And I think that if you're using it that way, addiction, it's hard to maintain it as a useful term. So all that to say, there's a lot of wrestling I have done and I'm still doing. I continue to believe that the addiction is a helpful term, and I think we can draw helpful lines around it that can help us personally and pastorally, and that can help us connect to our neighbors, people like Frank, who I described in my story, without connecting in ways that aren't true or seem too thin, which I think people like Mate sometimes fall into.
Thanks, Quentin. That was a model book launch. My question is, from your perspective, do you think Christians have a stake in the debate over whether drugs should be criminalized or decriminalized?
Thanks for the question. Yes, the easy, uncontroversial one. I think the first thing I will say is most people who I talk to about addiction or who know that I'm interested in addiction lead immediately with conversations of what I think should be legal or illegal. And in some of my Christian engagement and my teaching Christians, I want to do everything I can to not, I don't want to use a violent metaphor, but to really strongly say that isn't the first questions Christians should be asking. And we're bad on this on life issues as well, right? That as soon as you talk about abortion, people start talking about the Supreme Court decision of a Supreme Court in another country rather than talking about their responsibility to their own neighbors on their street and those kinds of things. I'll get down off my soapbox about that issue, but I do think sometimes we can fall into a kind of idolatry when we think, what is the thing that really matters? Well, the thing that really matters at the end of the day is what's legal or illegal. And I think Christians need to pick up our own responsibilities in our own homes, our own churches. Some Christians have vocations that place them in the public square that are considering policy and legislation. And I say, bless them. And their discernment is really important. We should pray for people who have those vocations without spending all of our time being so distracted from that we don't pick up what's in front of us. So that's my preamble. With that being said, I think yes. I think insofar as Christians want to think about what promotes the common good, that we have a stake in the debates about criminalization or decriminalization. One of the things that I say when I discuss this very briefly in the book is that amongst the many things that law is a teacher about the good. And we actually know, with respect to drugs, that legislation actually works this way. And we've seen this with cannabis. In places where cannabis is legalized, before legalization, advocates argue the legality doesn't matter. People who are going to use anyway. But then after it's legalized, the rates of use of cannabis go way up. And there's solid evidence now that the rates of addiction to cannabis go way up. What that suggests is that the law is functioning in part as a teacher, that at least for some subset of people, when it was illegal, they didn't do it because that signaled, maybe as a deterrent of punishment or maybe for other reasons, that it wasn't good. I see patients in the Emerge all the time, young people who their use of cannabis is undermining most of the good things of their life. And when I tell them you shouldn't use cannabis, they say, okay, boomer, and they roll their eyes. And honestly though, and because they say it's legal, it's natural, so stop moralizing. When from my perspective, again, I'm not moralizing, I'm trying to give them health advice. So I think that law is a teacher about the good, and there are certainly nuances to the ways that we think about that alongside the other functions of law. I do think in the debates about legalization, many people who advocate for decriminalization suggest that the only reason to criminalize drugs is some kind of war on drugs that punishes people who fundamentally need help. I agree that persons with addictions fundamentally need help and not punishment. But there might be reasons to make drugs illegal other than wanton punishment, notably protecting the very people who are vulnerable to developing addictions to drugs, and the use of law as a tool, not only as teacher, but also as a deterrent to protect those same people. So that's like a somewhat rambling response, but yes, insofar as we're invested in the common good, I think we have a stake in these debates. I think there's nuance there. Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you so much. A term that you use in your book that's quite new to me, I was just wondering if you could speak on outlying incontinence.
Oh dear, yes.
And so it's on the chapter of a personal model
totally.
and incontinence. But if you could just touch on it, because you've very eloquently spoken about the disease model versus the personal model or the choice model. But this was new to me, this chapter, and I was wondering if you could speak on that. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Two preliminary remarks. I know all of you medical people, when you hear incontinence, you think about urine. So, spoiler, no urine, I promise, in what follows. Secondly, I want to acknowledge this is a set of categories that I learned about from the wonderful book, Addiction and Virtue. So if you want to buy one book about addiction, you should not buy my book. You should buy Addiction and Virtue by Kent Dunnington. If you buy my book after, that's great too, but read Kent first. But one of the things that I learned from Kent and that I suggest as a core defining feature of addiction is incontinent action. Hopefully the description in the book is better than what I will say now, but very briefly, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle distinguishes between different categories of human action. So there aren't just voluntarist actions, that's all will, and determinist action where your will has nothing to do with it. There are mediating categories that attempt to explain why we behave the way we do. The ideal category of action for Aristotle is virtuous action. And so the virtuous actor rationally approves of what is good, and their bodily appetites, their desires, automatically align, and so they do what is good. We might say they do what is good entirely, authentically, or habitually. They don't have to exert their will to do what is good. They do it automatically because they've developed a virtue or a disposition. In contrast to the virtuous person, there is what Aristotle calls the continent person. You might think of self-control here. The continent person has reason, they know what is right, they know what they should do, and yet they experience some appetite, some factor that interferes with their ability to connect what they know to be good and how they behave. And again, the continent person successfully uses their will to go with what their reason tells them is good. And Aristotle sees virtuous action as higher than continent action, and yet he encourages continent action as good as the way to become virtuous. So a common saying in the virtue ethics world is, you can only become a patient person by doing what a patient person would do without yet being patient. It's sort of a fake it until you make it model of the good life. Thirdly, I'm almost done. Aristotle defines incontinent action. So the incontinent person, they rationally know what is good, but they again experience some middle interfering factor, appetite, and they cannot be self-controlled, and so they do what they rationally know to be wrong or not consistent with the good. I think this is a category of behavior that all of us can relate to. We often find ourselves doing things that we know we shouldn't do. I think St. Paul is the paradigmatic example of this in Romans when he says, the things I do, I hate, but the things I most want to do, I can't find myself doing. We see examples that we might see as incontinent narrated even in the world of the Bible. Finally, for Aristotle, there's a fourth category, which is vicious, which sounds very dramatic, but for him just corresponds to vice. And the vicious person rationally has misidentified the good. They believe the wrong to be right. Their reason has been misdirected. So they do what is wrong for the reasons of a vice, you might say. What I've argued in the book is that the choice model of addiction characterizes addictive behavior as vicious in Aristotelian terms. And the disease model of addiction narrates it as morbid, which is another category I won't get into here. But that actually the category of incontinence is a very illuminating category for what we intuitively feel about addictive behavior, that persons with addiction are still rationally able to desire something else. This is all over the literature about addiction, and certainly consistent with my conversations with thousands of patients. It isn't just that the person loves fentanyl more than their children. They love their children. They want to be with their children. They desperately want to be with their children. And yet this addiction is this thing that inhabits their mind and their person, that undermines their ability to act out of that desire that they have to be with their family or whatever it is. So that's a very brief but hopefully helpful summary of how the category of incontinence applies to addiction.
Well, let's express our appreciation again. perhaps just give him time to get to the bookstore, and then we can move out of that door over there and enjoy the donuts. Thanks again.
Thanks.
I'm Roger.